Good afternoon. Welcome to the presentation on Japanese business practices. Today, we're going to be focusing on the communication preferences for Japanese business in some of the following areas, such as written, spoken communications, meetings, and decision making. The Japanese are largely nonverbal. They rely on gestures and nonverbal cues to communicate. Business Insider gives the example of chopsticks at a restaurant. If you are at a business lunch or meeting with a Japanese colleague, use your chopsticks. If you appear to be uncomfortable, your Japanese colleague will notice and request a fork for you. This all shows that you are respecting their culture and trying to adapt. For if you try to adapt in a small area, such as using chopsticks, you will try to adapt in other larger areas of business. They do use silence as communication. For example, they use silence to calm down a tense situation. They use silence also to indicate that they are taking in the information and trying to process what you are saying or asking of them. So if a Japanese colleague is pausing, he's just thinking. Also, respect. Bowing is one of the things in Japanese culture that shows respect, but it is very complicated. The Japanese will not expect you to know how to bow, but a simple bend at the waist will show that you are respecting their culture. In written communication, use structure and fewer words. The Japanese think that American contracts and reports are way too wordy and way too long. So condense those down to just a few things. Use structure such as bold, italics, headlines in order to communicate with written communication. Give as much context as you can. They like to know the whole big picture and the whole story. Also provide helpful information and don't be afraid to provide definitions for things that you may not think that they know. More definitions and more context is better in written communication than less. The spoken communication, again, we talked about how they use nonverbal cues. They're a very high context culture versus us, which is low context. So please be sure to use your gestures, use your nonverbal cues when you're speaking with your Japanese colleagues. They do like to avoid conflict. So they will not try to argue with you, especially in public. Make sure that you are not having very strong opinions one way or another when communicating with your Japanese colleagues. They also value punctuality. It is expected for you to be 10 to 15 minutes early to a meeting. That is the minimum. If you want to be a little bit earlier, that's fine too, but that will show respect for the person that you are meeting with. Meetings are simply a formality in Japanese culture. They've already reached their consensus. So what they do before their meetings is they meet privately one-on-one with those who are going to be involved in the meeting. When they come to the meeting, they already know what the decision is that they are making. So make sure you talk to your Japanese colleagues before the meetings. Make sure that in the meeting, you're not presenting any information that has not been presented before. Hiding information will kind of show a little bit of distrust within your Japanese colleagues. With decision making, the process is long, so please be patient. There's deliberation at first, then they gather all of the data that they need, they analyze that data, they reach a consensus, and they have to make sure that that is approved by senior staff before the decision is made. That's another respectful thing in the Japanese culture. So please be patient with your Japanese colleagues. They know that their decision-making process is long and is involved. However, they believe that that is the best way to make a decision and involving as many people as possible who are going to be affected by the decision. References for further study. There's a lot in this presentation that I was not able to impart to you due to time constraints, but these references will help you learn a little bit more about things such as dress code and how to present a business card in Japanese culture. So in conclusion, remember that we are trying to show as much respect as we can for their culture. They're trying to reach a consensus. They don't want to argue or deliberate in a meeting. Have patience for their decision-making processes, and make sure that you're providing as much clarity, context to them in your written and spoken communications. Define your terms. Remember, they do not have the advantage of being native English speakers such as we are, and provide as much information and context as possible during your meetings and communication with your Japanese partners.